Scientists have uncovered a series of fossils that shows that the world's oldest known ankylosaur was a lot more armored than previously thought, but it also means its descendants were less armored. Welcome back to Paleopedia and meet the world's oldest known definitive ankylosaur, a heavily armored animal known as Spicomelis. Measuring about 3 to 4 meters in length and likely weighing around a ton or so, Spicomelis lived in Africa around 165 million years ago, making it not only the oldest known definitive ankylosaur, it makes it the oldest and, as far as I can tell, the only known ankylosaur from Africa itself. Spicomelis was originally known from just a single partial rib discovered, or I guess acquired, in 2019 by the Natural History Museum of London from a fossil dealer in Cambridge. And then in 2023, Susanna Maidment, who initially described this partial rib bone as Spicomelis, led a team of paleontologists from England, America, and Morocco, where the fossil was originally acquired in, back to the area where the fossil was found in to see if they couldn't find any more fossils to give us a better understanding of what Spicomelis looked like. And they found quite a few fossils, including cranial bones. They found ribs and spikes and all sorts of other things that gave us quite a good understanding of what this ankylosaur most likely looked like, as well as gave us a clue as to how armored it was, and it was incredibly well armored. Something interesting about Spicomelis is simply how the armor is attached to the animal. In most ankylosaurs, the osteoderms, which are the armor plates and spikes of ankylosaurs, they're fused or embedded into the muscle tissue of the ankylosaur. With Spicomelis, its armor is fused directly to the bone. Something else that's interesting about Spicomelis that hints at its early point in ankylosaur evolution and diversity is its tail weapon. Not all members of the overarching Ankylosauria clade had tail weapons. Some, like the nodosaurs, didn't have any at all. They relied mostly on those bony plates, and a lot of them had spikes protruding out of their shoulders and along their sides. What you might call the true Ankylosaurs, the family within the Ankylosaur clade called Ankylosauridae, these would be dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus itself, are the ones that had the bony tail club at the end of their tails. In regards to Spicomelis, we actually aren't fully certain yet whether it had a tail club or not. We do have fossils of the fused tail vertebrae, which would be like the handle of its weapon, indicating that it did in fact have a weapon. Current reconstructions based on the fossils uncovered in 2023 seem to indicate that instead of a tail club, though, it had tail spikes, similar to stegosaurs, which would make sense considering its early divergence from the group of dinosaurs that would become the stegosaurs, of which ankylosaurs are closely related to. But what makes Spicomelis really interesting is just how armored it was, especially compared to later ankylosaurs. Like I mentioned a minute ago, Spicomelis was armored with osteoderms fused directly to its bones, which is different from later ankylosaurs where their osteoderms are embedded in their muscle tissues. Maybe that's just a factor of Spicomelis being an early diverging member of Ankylosaur, and as the lineage continued to evolve, they lost that aspect for perhaps better locomotion. I don't know. But something else unique about Spicomelis was not only was it super heavily osteodermed armored, like all the other ankylosaurs, but it was unbelievably spiky as well. It had spikes all over the place. It had spikes growing out of its neck over 3 feet long. It had spikes coming out of its hips and out of its shoulders. Even its tail, as I mentioned a moment ago, appeared to be spiked. And there were even blade-like spikes coming out of its back and ribs out of the osteoderms. It was insane. It's certainly one of the spikiest dinosaurs that have ever been uncovered, and definitely one of the most well-armored ankylosaurs out there. And that right there is what makes Spicomelis really interesting for ankylosaur evolution, because it's clearly one of the most, if not just far out, the most armored ankylosaur known. But it's also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the oldest representative of ankylosaurs in general. This means that as ankylosaurs continued to evolve and diversify throughout the Jurassic and Cretaceous period, they actually lost quite a bit of their armor. They opted less for the spikes and moved more into just the bony plates protecting their entire body, and their tails moved from spikes like stegosaurs to those clubs, and of course some ankylosaurs like the nodosaurs lost those entirely. Most species of animals, if they opt on an evolutionary level to become armored or lean more into physical defense like plates or spines or spikes or what have you, they tend to get more armored as they evolve, but that's clearly not the case for ankylosaurs. They appear to have gotten less armored as they evolved. But nothing in evolution happens for just no reason, so something had to have caused the ankylosaurs to opt more for the bony plating rather than the spiky defense that Spicomelis is known for, and Susanna Maidment thinks she understands what's going on. 165 million years ago, the dominant predators were the allosaurs, a medium-sized group of theropods that relied on bleeding their prey items to death. But in the northern hemisphere specifically, where ankylosaurs are known, a new type of predator was starting to evolve. This new group of predator were the tyrannosaurs, and while at the time of Spicomelis and the early diverging members of Ankylosaurs, they were relatively small, they pretty quickly became similar sized to allosaurs, and in some cases got even bigger, eventually becoming those bone-crushing giants like Tarbosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and Tyrannosaurus rex. Professor Maidment doesn't seem to think that the spikes of Spicomelis were used primarily for defense. That was the armored plating underneath the spikes. She thinks that Spicomelis used its spikes more for display, for mating purposes, and driving off rivals during the mating season. Maybe as the Tyrannosaurs continued to evolve, get bigger, become more dangerous, bone-crushing predators, the Ankylosaurs moved away from the spike defense, if they were really using spikes for defense at all, and relied on those flat plates of bony armor purely for defense. So instead of being able to show off, the Ankylosaurs had to defend themselves from the bone-crushing bites of the Tyrannosaurs, and that's what led the descendants of Spicomelis to lean more into the plated armor rather than the showy spikes. This new information about Spicomelis highlights how little we know about early ankylosaur evolution, because Spicomelis represents quite a bit. It represents the oldest known representative of ankylosaurs. It's the first and only ankylosaur known from Africa so far, and it's the most armored ankylosaur ever known, and it's really early in their evolution. So it just shows that we have a lot more to learn, and there's a lot more fossils to be unearthed.